Best to start. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm really pleased to introduce today's speaker, Keith Bender. Keith is among those very small minority of economists who holds a funding, project that is funded by the prestigious ESRC in the UK. So this is, we are looking forward. The project is basically performance-related pay and health, and today's paper is part of that project. So we're quite looking forward to finding out more about that. Just before I pass the floor on to the virtual floor to Keith, the usual things. The seminar is being recorded. It will be available on the GLO website in the next couple of days. Please mute your microphones during the presentation, but feel free to unmute if you have a question to ask. Keith is happy to take questions during the seminar, and hopefully we should have, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes at the end to address the questions as well. Okay, Keith, over to you. And
wonderful. Thank you very much, Madhu. That's very helpful. And thank you everybody for coming from wherever you are in the world, because I know we've got folks here from America, from Canada. Hi, Fraser. How are you doing? And various other parts of the UK and Europe. So thank you very much for having me come along. As Matthew said, this is a funded project. So I'll start off with the usual disclaimer of thanking the ESRC as well as the Scottish Economic Society. They were the ones that funded the pilot study that we used to kind of give a proof of concept to what I'm going to be talking about today. And once we had that, then we were able to go to the ESRC and convince them that what we're doing is feasible and it's interesting as well. You'll see, hopefully you all see the blue screen. And you'll see a whole bunch of names on here. So one of the attributes of this paper is that it is very interdisciplinary. So we have economists like myself and my colleague here, Yannis Theodosiou. We're very traditional empirical labor economists. Give us a data set and we can do almost anything with it. But that's not what we're doing in this particular paper. But what we're doing here is working with folks in psychology and health psychology here at the University of Aberdeen. So Julia Allen and Dan Powell are in our health psychology group over in the medical school. Sandro Stoffel was the first research fellow on the project. He is a more pure experimental economist, so he helped us really do the groundwork of laying out the experiments. And the current research fellow on the project is Nicole Andalik, who has her PhD in psychology, but she is an absolute expert in running experiments and working on these kinds of physiological measures of stress that I'll talk about today. So we have a kind of cast of thousands, which is proven to be interesting, and it's a very interdisciplinary team that we've collected here. And I think that's one of the reasons why the ESRC was quite keen on this particular project, because of the strong interdisciplinarity of it. Now, as Matt Lube also said, even though the title of the paper and of the talk is Employment Contracts and Stress, what we're really going to be focusing on here is performance-related pay. And we all know kind of performance-related pay. We're all labor economists. Performance, the idea of tying pay to performance is potentially a fundamental one, particularly in many neoclassical labor economics theories. The fundamental equation that you talk about in first year or in any labor economics class is that wages are equal to marginal revenue product, right? So there's this tie between how people are paid and how much people are paid and their productivity. And kind of depending on how you measure performance-related pay, it could be anywhere up to 40% of workers in Europe and the US. Now, there are many forms of performance-related pay, from kind of piece rates, which is what we're going to be doing within this particular study, where you're paid specifically for the production, to sort of combined forms where you get a salary and maybe you get a sales commission if you're maybe a salesperson, or billable hours if you're a lawyer, or those kinds of things, bonuses for working in the firm, and that kind of thing. So there is quite a wide gamut, and the higher numbers here are more inclusive in its definition of performance-related pay. But the whole idea of any of these forms of performance-related pay is to try to tie a person's pay to their productivity and their performance, and that should hopefully generate a strong productivity link, because if people's pay is determined by their productivity, early work by Ed Lazier certainly talked about ways of drawing out more productivity from workers, because it motivates those workers to work harder, generates those incentives for more productive workers to want to work in those performance-related pay schemes. So there's both the kind of the incentive structure of trying to get people more productive. It's also a selective selection mechanism. So those people who are more productive generally are drawn to these kinds of payment contracts because they get a higher rate of pay for that. So that's kind of the basic story, and why lots and lots of labor economists kind of focus on performance-related pay. There are other potential positive benefits to performance-related pay beyond just the productivity side of things from a firm's point of view. A well-known paper by Booth and Frank and Jolly in '99, showed that there's higher income. Although again, whether that's because of the kind of selection effect or the incentive effect is still somewhat debated, perhaps. There's some evidence that John, who's in on the call, and Colin Green had on a positive relationship between performance-related pay and job satisfaction. Although there's maybe some counter evidence by colleagues here at Aberdeen that said maybe that's related to those with higher incomes, but not those with lower incomes. But there seems to be perhaps a relationship there as well. So lots of good reasons to think that performance-related pay is a good way, if you can, to pay your workers. But, and there's always a but in these kinds of things. There's a small and potentially growing literature that shows that in practice, it's actually quite difficult to get that contract right from that performance-related pay framework. And it's sort of many well-known examples in teaching. So this idea of teaching to the test or grade inflation would be one way of not getting the right kind of contract set, and you end up with unintended consequences because of that. There's a famous paper by Freeman and Kleiner in Industrial Relations in 2005, where they looked at a manufacturing firm, I think they made shoes, going from piece rates to standard rates, and they found a whole series of again, unintended consequences, where moving to those kind of standard hourly rates, they found decreased wastage, a redirection on quality rather than quantity, decreased monitoring costs, a whole host of other positive things that a firm might really like. So there was a question in I've got the chat up here. So the standard rates just means an hourly rate. So you're just paid by the hour, as many firms actually do. So there's already a literature out there that talks about the unintended consequences, mostly around the contract itself and the difficulty of actually setting up the contract correctly. I'm not going to go down that road, but I am going to go down the road of thinking about a different kind of unintended consequence, one that interestingly has been known about for potentially quite a long time, but has only had relatively little research on it until recently. So As any good Scottish economist should do, you should always have a quote by Adam Smith in your presentation. So interestingly, Adam Smith has written on maybe an unintended consequence of performance-related pay. So in The Wealth of Nations, he was looking at miners, which may well have been some of my ancestry in central part of Scotland, where part of my family is from. And of course, back then, in the middle part of the 18th century, individuals, when they were working, they weren't paid a salary, they weren't paid standard rates, they were paid, if you were a miner, you were paid by the measure of coal that you would actually bring out of the earth. And so Smith observed the following, in fine 18th century language: workmen, when they are liberally paid by the piece, are very apt to overwork themselves and to ruin their health and constitution in a few years. So what Smith is observing there is that there's a linkage between this idea of being paid by the piece, a very strict form of performance-related pay, and eventual health outcomes for the workers that have this kind of piece rate form of performance-related pay. Now, when I read this, now going maybe on about 10 years ago, I thought, well, this is really, really interesting, obviously, and I'm sure there must be scads and scads and scads written about it, and actually, that is not the case, and so it would generate several papers by me and with a variety of other people's, and is the motivation for thinking about this particular project. But before I get into that literature, what I want to do is to think about, or to talk about that literature. I want to break it out into what kind of pathways might there be between piece rates and this kind of performance-related pay and the health and the constitution of workers, to use Smith's term. So I'm going to talk about three potential pathways. So one pathway is potentially through injuries, and this is kind of in the mantra of working harder and not smarter type of thing, putting it on its head, and the idea that paying by the piece makes individuals really focus on the quantity, particularly if that contract's not written correctly, and that may cause workers to cut corners, to have accidents, to use machinery maybe not in the safest of way, but in the highest productivity way. So there, interestingly, have been a lot of papers that have been written on this idea of injuries. They tend to be focused on case studies and occupational case studies. So here's just a whole list of different occupations where there's some element of performance-related pay, and they measure health typically through injuries, although some of them have other measures of health. But you've got loggers, you've got farmers, you've got truckers or lorry drivers, depending on which country you're in, fertilizer workers, and most recently, Vietnamese factory workers. All of them finding a relationship, at least a correlation, perhaps causation, between performance-related pay and injuries on the job. There is a firm case study, the paper that I mentioned earlier in Industrial Relations by Freeman and Kleiner. It was shoe manufacturers. One of the things that they found within the study that they did was when they moved from the piece rate to the performance-related pay rate to the straight rate, the standard rate, is that workman's comp insurance claims went down. So there were fewer injuries that they were observing in that shoe manufacturing company that they were looking at in that case study. There have been a couple nationally representative papers that use nationally representative data. One is a paper that I wrote along with John, who again is on the call, and Colin Green, and this was in the journal Population Economics in 2012, where we look at about 30,000 workers in the EU, and again, we find quite a robust relationship between piece rates and injury rates in these firms. And then there's a more recent paper using US data by Ben Artz, one of John and my former PhD students, and John in economic, I believe, they're looking at this from a kind of panel data framework. And again, they find a strong relationship between performance-related pay and injury. So that's one mechanism of how performance-related pay might actually impact health, is through injuries. A second pathway might be through the amount of hours that individuals work on in performance-related pay jobs. One of the things, again, one of the findings from the performance-related pay literature is that those who are paid by their performance tend to work more hours. And it makes sense from the incentive point of view, if nothing else, is if they're working, then they should, and being productive, then they will earn more money. And so what that potentially means, given that the total amount of time obviously is fixed, if they're spending more time at work, they're spending less time in leisure or all the other non-work times. And some of that leisure might be applied to time-intensive healthy activities, so exercising, going out for a walk, cooking a healthy meal. These kinds of activities that might promote health become more crunched when you have fewer non-work hours. So you could think of the lawyer who's getting billable hours, who orders takeout or gets a pizza delivered to the law firm instead of going and cooking themselves a nice meal, or they're working late nights instead of going and exercising. Now, unlike injuries, which might be an immediate effect, the kind of relationship that we're probably talking about here is not going to be an immediate one. If a lawyer on billable hours or a car salesman, we just bought a car, so I'm thinking a lot about car salesmen. If they get takeout at their desk for one day, that's obviously not going to harm them. But the accumulated effect of that, maybe over months or years of behavioral changes, could potentially affect their overall health. So my colleague Giannis, who is part of the project team here, and I published a paper in 2014 in OEP that used a kind of duration analysis using the British Household Panel Survey, starting with a sample of healthy workers, and then looked at the amount of time that they spent in performance-related pay over a long period of time, and found that the longer people were in performance-related pay, the more likely they were to develop poor cardiovascular health and to experience poor mental health. Interestingly, again, work from Ben and John, and in this case, Colin, again, using the NLSY data, found that perhaps one of the mechanisms that's generating this, or at least a contributing factor to the poor health, is that performance-related pay seems to be associated with increased drinking and drug use. And if that's seen as a way of kind of trying to lower stress or try to get past the extra effort that you've got to spend at work, obviously there are well-known health effects for excess drinking and drug use. So again, there could be longer term effects of performance-related pay on health. That's the second pathway. The third pathway is potentially through stress. So I mentioned it just a second ago, that perhaps if these performance-related pay contracts are generating this kind of extra work, this extra stress, maybe there's an outlet of, as John has found, in terms of increased alcohol use and drug abuse, but the stress itself can be debilitating in terms of health. And it really perhaps comes in a couple different ways. One might be just the inability to relax because of that pressure to be productive, right? If you're the car salesman that we've been dealing with, if you're not following up leads, he was emailing me on the weekends to make sure that we were still interested in the car, that kind of pressure of not being able to step back and relax is going to be more heightened under a performance-related pay scheme. Another thing we know about many performance-related pay contracts is that the income stream that that is generated is more uncertain than if you know that you're going to be working 40 hours a week, or you get a monthly salary, and every month you know that you're going to get X amount of pounds or X amount of dollars. You know that that's going to be standard, but again, my car salesman friend, you know, if he has a really good month, he could have a huge pay. If he's like he has been probably for the last 4 or 5 months, locked down here in Scotland, where essentially you couldn't buy a car, then all he has is his whatever minimum salary that he has. He doesn't have the commissions that are on top of that. So there could be quite a bit of uncertainty on the payment scheme, which for particular demographics, if you have kids or you have a mortgage or these kinds of things, can generate potentially lots of stress. So if you are constantly affected by high stress or quite variable stress, there's clear medical evidence that shows that there are bad health outcomes when you have this kind of long-term persistent stress. So here's just here's a paper by McEwen in 1998 in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. But there's lots and lots of medical literature that shows bad health outcomes with performance-related pay. And then listed here, another very recent paper by Dahl and Pierce in the Academy of Management, who look at prescription drug use of particular kinds of drugs to combat stress, and found that those who were paid by performance were much more likely to have prescriptions for these kinds of anti-stress drugs. So again, there could be a link with this. And just as a kind of side note, in the paper that Giannis and I wrote in OEP in 2014, we were able to use the general health questionnaire that's in the British Household Panel. And one of the questions there is, you know, how stressed are you feeling? And we presented some very correlational results that, yeah, indeed, those being paid by performance are more likely to express that higher stress. Okay, so we've got these three pathways. What this project is about, and I'm already 23 minutes in, so I better get to the point of what I'm trying to do here, is really to focus on this stress element of performance-related pay. Because all of the studies that I've presented so far have two main problems, because they're almost always based on either case studies, so very specific to a particular occupation, for example, and all those occupational ones that I talked about earlier, or they're based on the kind of standard survey data, the British Household Panel, National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the European Working Conditions Survey. All of them are standard good quality, high quality surveys, but we know that performance-related pay causes selection, and we're really could potentially be worried about the selection effects in there. And you know, papers have tried to deal with this kind of selection or endogeneity. We know that there are many ways that you can do it, by using panel methods, by using heterogeneity corrections in duration models. You can try to find some instrumental variables, but as probably everybody who's on this call knows, the difficulty of coming up with valid instrumental variables for these kinds of things is very difficult unless you have a natural experiment, and that tends to be quite challenging in this field, for example. So we've got a problem with endogeneity. The second potential problem is that often, and particularly for any studies about stress, these almost always tend to be self-reported measures of stress, and there's a strong reluctance within economics to use self-reported stress. As I had a PhD a professor when I was in my PhD, he said he would much rather talk to rocks than to learn about you know, what people actually felt about a particular thing. So you know, this can be a potential problem if we're trying to measure stress, because we're pretty much subject to people just answering maybe on a 5-point scale or 7 or even 10-point scale about how stressed they are. So the main idea of what this paper and this project is all about is to try to resolve these two problems, and that comes from an experiment. What we will argue is a good way to maybe address this is through an experimental approach. So before I get into that, I do want to stop in case there are any questions maybe at this point. Okay, good. So, so there are a couple papers. There are lots and lots of papers that look at performance-related pay and various aspects of who chooses performance-related pay, how much extra productivity you get in an experimental setting. So there are lots of papers on that. There are decidedly many fewer papers that actually look at something around stress or even ask questions about stress in that kind of performance-related pay setting. So there are two that I want to highlight. One is by Doman and Falk in the American Economic Review in 2011. Now, what they did allow the self-selection in their experiments into performance-related pay or not. So it doesn't address the first of the problems that I mentioned on the previous slide. They do ask self-reported stress. They do find that those who are in performance-related pay express higher stress than those who are not. But of course, they also did not ask before the experiment, were they stressed or not? So you couldn't get any idea of the change. So perhaps just those people who were on performance-related pay were more stressed anyway coming into the experiment. So while there's then some evidence, it doesn't really kind of address the kinds of things that we want to think about. Then there's another paper by Cadspian et al., another experimental paper that does do a little bit of exogeneity. So it kind of allocates individuals into a performance-related pay or not contract over several rounds. So that part is exogenous. They still ask self-reported stress. They do find that that those who are in performance-related pay, particularly if they were more risk averse, the story is of their paper is about risk aversion. Those people do report higher self-reported stress. But again, they don't ask their stress beforehand, and it's not really set up to focus on the stress. What they really wanted to focus on was how much performance-related pay actually didn't increase performance as much as they expected, perhaps because of the stress that individuals were on. So these two studies, which are the only ones that we've found within that experimental literature that asks anything about stress, don't deal with the problems from the survey data. Again, this idea of exogeneity and the non-subjective measure of stress. So the first point in an experimental setting is easy to do. We can randomize performance-related pay or not across the subject. So that's relatively easy to do. From an economics point of view, trying to come up with easy non-subjective measures of stress is not so straightforward. And this is where we rely on the interdisciplinarity of our colleagues in health psychology and psychology to give us a way that they measure stress in the lab. Now, there are potentially lots of ways that you can measure stress. You can think of things like heart rate or blood pressure, but of course, those have very common potential problems in measurement, because just the fact of putting a blood pressure cuff on you or knowing that you're getting your pulse measured can affect the measurements themselves, the kind of white lab coat effect. But something that is much less affected by this is cortisol. And it's one of the reasons why in psychology, cortisol is used probably more often than these other ways of measuring. So what cortisol is it's part of the, let's see if I can get this right, I always muddle this, hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, the HPA axis. I think I did that okay. And the idea of the HPA axis is that when you are stressed, the adrenaline starts going. You're trying to go through the sort of ancient fight or flight mechanism, and the body releases this cortisol to facilitate the recovery from that stressful action, whatever that might be. 100,000 years ago, the lion that's chasing you, or maybe today, performance-related pay. So the idea is that this cortisol, this hormone, is released to bring you back down to a kind of baseline level. Now, what medicine has been able to show is that repeated stress, so this kind of even low-grade stress, but if it's repeated, then the cortisol becomes less and less effective, meaning that it's never actually able to get you back down to that level, this level of allostasis that it's called in the medical literature, bring you down to that more calm level. And that's when all of the things that are helpful for the fight or flight thing of increased adrenaline and increased blood pressure and all of that can end up being harmful, because that doesn't get cleaned out of the system because of the cortisol. So cortisol is a good thing to try to measure in terms of looking at the body's reaction to stress. Now, there are lots of things that can potentially affect the level of cortisol. There is a natural rhythm throughout the day of when you wake up, the cortisol is higher, and then it declines. Various activities can also can also affect the level of cortisol. So having a cigarette or having caffeine, exercising, all of these kinds of things. So we do need to do some controls for that. But it's particularly good in an experimental context because cortisol is secreted very quickly. So it starts to be secreted within 10 minutes of a stressful event happening. So that's good. If you want to have an hour experiment, we can get a reaction quite quickly. And we can collect it through saliva, which may seem a sort of icky thing to try to get, but it's certainly much better than trying to draw blood, and you can find cortisol in blood as well, but certainly we don't want to go anywhere near that. So all we need is a test tube that looks something like this. I feel like a real scientist when I can actually use a test tube. My brother is a chemistry professor in South Carolina, and so now I can say that I'm a real scientist just like him. But what they do essentially, what the subjects do, is that there's a little swab that's inside, so they can chew this for a minute, and there's enough saliva that goes on there that when we send it to a lab, they can measure the cortisol that's present in the saliva. Okay, so that's what's going to be the idea of both of this paper, but overall in the project is to think about different ways of doing performance-related pay, and then collecting their spit, and then analyzing that for cortisol changes as we change the treatment and think about them over time. So specifically in this particular study, what we're trying to do is a relatively simple and straightforward experiment. We're copying Doman and Falk in the sense that there's a show-up fee. So they come to the experiment, as with most experiments, you get paid for that, and then randomly, unlike Doman and Falk, who allowed them to choose, randomly we're going to allocate into one of two conditions. So there's one that's a performance-related pay condition, so that they're going to be doing maths problems, different addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division problems by hand, no calculators or mobile phones. But those who are in the performance-related pay condition get paid 20 pence per correct answer, right? So a straight piece rate kind of performance-related pay system. Alternatively, we're randomly allocated into the other condition, which is the non-PRP condition. You could call this a minimum performance contract. So as long as they get 10 questions correct, they will receive a fixed payment of £5 for those 10 correct answers. They can continue to work if they wish, but they won't get anything extra for that extra effort. So we're in one of these two conditions. And again, it's another thing that's different from Doman and Falk. They did have a non-PRP condition, but they didn't have to hit any kind of performance criteria. And we thought that it would be useful to have people put forth some effort to get a payment in that case. So what is new with this particular study is, well, one, again, we're randomly allocating. And the reason for doing that is because we really want to nail down the causality, because that's one of the things that the literature has attempted to do, but probably hasn't done necessarily well so far. We're going to be measuring stress objectively, looking at these cortisol samples, and we're going to do it 4 times over the experiment, as I'll show in just a second. And importantly, too, we're going to control for individual heterogeneity, because of course, some people may be really good at maths, other people may not be good at maths. So we want to be able to take out that, that perhaps ability bias that might be in there. We could, and we will, ask some demographic information. So, you know, if they're majoring in the sciences, they might have a higher aptitude for maths, but those are blunt instruments. But what we're going to do here is to have a crossover design so that when they come into the lab, they're randomly allocated into one of the 2 conditions. Then we invite them back a week later and we switch the condition on them. So that if you started in the PRP condition, then in the second session, you have the non-PRP condition. So everybody is treated, everybody experiences the other one. But what it allows us to do from a kind of metric point of view is that now we can run a fixed effects regression and hopefully net out the ability. Okay, so that's, yep.
So quick question. So coming in to this experiment, did they know that they are going to be maths questions?
No.
Okay.
They knew nothing about the thing except that they knew that they would get the £5 show up fee, and that they had the opportunity of earning up actually to another £10, because they could answer up to 50 questions. So that would be that would if they were in the PRP condition, they could get another £10.
Yeah, I think Elena is saying that the second time, is that right?
So the second time so they do know that there are math questions, indeed, and I don't think I've got it here. It's in the paper. There's particularly for the PRP people, the stress level goes up. If you look at the average level of stress, it goes up once they come in for the second one. Now, interestingly, what they don't know is that we're going to switch the condition on them, and they have no knowledge from us. Of course, they could have talked to somebody else in the experiment. They have no knowledge from us about what the other condition is. All they know is when they come in, well, let me go to the next slide, because it's a good segue into exactly what we do. But all they know is that we tell them that you're going to be in this payment contract, and good luck, and on you go. And when they come back, they don't know that they're going to be switched. Presumably, they think that they're going to be in the same kind of contract. I don't know what they're thinking, but they don't know any other information than what they experienced in the first experiment.
Just one other clarification. So in the non-PRP, they get £5 for 10 correct answers. Do they know each time? Would they know, let's say, the first 10 that they have answered are the correct answers?
Yes. So on the screen, everything is known to the participant for both contracts. So so for those in PRP, it will say on the screen always you've answered 5 of 6 questions correctly. There's a timer that's up in the corner of the screen as well, and then the question is given there. They enter in their answer. The next screen is correct or not correct, and it just updates. For the non-PRP people, again, it's the same kind of thing initially. So you've answered 6 out of 7 right, 7 out of 8, 8 out of 9. When they hit 10 of 11, then there's a banner on the screen that says you have hit your minimum performance contract. You will be paid £5 extra, and that banner stays up there for the rest of the experiment, or for the rest of their time doing the calculations. Okay, so I've kind of already gone through this, but let me just very quickly show you the timeline. So so we bring them into the lab, and I should also say that all of this happened before the lockdown, so this should not be affected in any way by COVID or anything. So we had kind of standard lab here in Aberdeen, bringing in students at the University of Aberdeen. So we bring them in, we have their consent, we allocate them to a seat, start the experiment. We give them about 20 minutes to try to relax a little bit. One of the things we found from the pilot study was when they came in, they tended to be quite stressed, in part because I think they don't know anything about the experiment. So we give them little mindfulness coloring things and some colored pencils and such, and so they can sit there, and we explain the broad ideas of the experiment to them in the first 10 minutes, then certainly give them 10 minutes to relax. Then we measure a baseline level of cortisol, and we ask the general health questionnaire questions about subjective stress and sleep deprivation and all of those kind of things. Then they enter phase 2 of the experiment. So they have about no more than 10 minutes to practice 4 questions: a math, a addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division question. We tell them it's practice. There's no timer on it. We say whether they get it right or not, but we tell them it doesn't matter. Then we allocate the treatment, so whether they're in performance-related pay or not, and we tell them that. Then we give them 10 minutes to do the work task. So this is our stressor for our 10 minutes, which is important for cortisol. Then we measure their cortisol right after the 10 minutes is finished. We also ask them other questions about how stressed they feel now. And then to allow for this, this differentiated way that cortisol can affect different people differently, we measure cortisol 2 other times to try to get a pattern of the cortisol. So there's another relaxation period of 10 minutes, and we measure cortisol a 3rd time, another 10-minute relaxation where they're coloring in their little things or drawing. We've had some great art that's being generated by the lab. Another 10 minutes, and then we get a 4th cortisol measurement, and then we pay them, and they go on their way. Then what we do with our little things, just to tell you, so we take so each of the test tubes are labeled. There's a little label here so we can track all of that back. We freeze it, and then when we're finished with the experiment, we cold pack all of that and send it to a lab. In this case, it's the University of Trier in Germany, to analyze the cortisol, and they send us back the results of the 4 measures for each individual person that we have, and then we can track that back to whether they were in the performance-related pay contract or not. So that's the framework of the experiment. So as in Doman and Falk, we ask the same kinds of subjective questions, just again to give us a baseline for thinking about what Doman and Falk did. So we ask about their stress, exhaustion, effort, and strain. But obviously what we're really focusing on here is an objective measure, and that's the idea of cortisol. So with 4 measures of cortisol, there actually are a variety of ways that you can try to measure this, this effect. So one way would be just to measure the overall cortisol output. So what I have on the screen here is just a kind of example typical cortisol reaction to a stressor. So the first baseline one would give you an initial measure of cortisol. Then the stressor happens between sample 1 and sample 2. We would expect the cortisol to go up. And then in the relaxation times between sample 2 and 3 and 3 and 4, we would expect that cortisol potentially to go down. This isn't anybody's necessarily their cortisol, it's just an example. So one way of measuring the cortisol output with these 4 measures is through what psychologists call the area under the curve, which is exactly what it says, is that it's just measuring the vertical area underneath, in our case, 4 points. If you had more, you could do more. But what this kind of tells you is what the total amount of cortisol is for the 4 samples that you have. And they call this the area under the curve with respect to ground, meaning that the base is 0. We're less interested in that because we don't care so much about what the overall level of cortisol is. And there's a lot of variation around, just normal heterogeneity around that. What we really care about is what is the change in cortisol, much more than the overall level of cortisol. So we use 3 different measures of measuring cortisol change. So the first one is what's called the area under the curve with respect to increase. So if I change my pointer here and use a pen, and my apologies because I'm using a mouse here, but let's start off with this original baseline point. And if I just draw a line that's supposed to be flat, my apologies for that, that's supposed to be just a flat line with whatever baseline that is. What the area under the curve with respect to increase is it's measuring the difference between the actual level of cortisol and this line, right? So we take it at a baseline, and then we see the variation from that baseline rather than calculating all the stuff that's underneath. Clearly, these 2 things are related, but they're not. There's subtle differences in the way that they're being measured. That's one way to do it. There are other ways. So we use these measures of change as well. So we take peak change. So that would be the peak of whichever one of the 3 samples that they peak at in terms of their cortisol, and subtract away the baseline. In this case that I have here, that's sample 2 minus sample 1, but it could be that it continued to increase and sample 3 was higher. So we just take the largest change that we can get. We could also look at the overall change, so where we start with the baseline versus the last one. Now, in this case, the last one is lower, so it could actually be negative, but it could have gone up and been higher as well. So just a kind of before and after kind of effect. And then we're going to compare this between the 2 treatment allocations. Okay, so we'll have 4 outcome measures using the cortisol. Okay, so I'll go just quickly through this because I've already talked about this. So we have a lab here in Aberdeen, so we've used that. All sessions were held at the same time because, again, this circadian rhythm where cortisol starts off relatively high in the morning and declines during the day. So we just picked a time. We thought it would be easier to get students to come along in the afternoon than in the morning. So all sessions happened at 2 o'clock. We've told the students not to do the things that affect cortisol levels and potentially the reactivity. So things like drinking caffeine, smoking, exercising, eating should be on there. We've asked them to refrain, but we also asked them if they did any of these things so we can control for that in a regression. As mentioned before, all subjects are told that they'll get the 5 pounds regardless, and they have an opportunity to earn more money, but that's all that we tell them initially. And then for this crossover, because again, we had them come a week later, they actually register for 2 sessions. So if they're on the Monday, they come first Monday, and then they come a week later at the same time. And again, they're all from the University of Aberdeen. Okay, so the sample that we have is 155. How did we invite them? Do they know each other? So it is possible that they do know each other. We have a database called ORSI, which is a common database, I think, for many experimental labs. Students register for that, for not only our experiments, for any of our experimental group, and then they get invitations that will list the number of the different sessions that they could go to, and then they just sign up for that. So they may know each other, but they may not. It depends on. It's a bit random. So we recruited 155 students. Not everybody came back, though, for their second session. And because that crossover is important, we lost 11 subjects because of that. we looked at the means of those. There didn't seem to be anything that stuck out, and it importantly doesn't seem to be correlated to whether they were in performance-related pay in the first session or not, which is what we would be worried about. Some had extreme cortisol values, more than 4 standard deviations away from the mean. And the standard way of dealing with that in psychology, and we're just following that methodology, is to drop those because we're not quite sure what's happening there. It could be just a problem in the lab, but it could be something that's just going on with them, and you're not quite sure the results that you get. So the resulting sample that we ended up with was 137 individuals that we saw twice and had relevant information for all the other things. And mostly they had similar characteristics. I don't want to spend time on this because I'm running out of time quickly. I want to get to the results. I think the only thing that really is kind of different across the first sample and the final sample is they tend to be a little bit more female for whatever reason. But otherwise, the other demographics that we have, gender, what year at the university they are, the broad age range, what discipline that they're getting their degree in, whether they're again in the performance-related pay in the initial session, and then the number of observations. Okay, finally to some results. So let me start off with the self-reported stress, because of course what we want to kind of see that we're at least getting results there. So we get similar self-reported stress pre-task. So the kind of orangish red here is non-PRP, and the kind of teal is PRP. So before they know anything, their stress level is exactly the same or very, very similar on our 5-point scale. But afterward, those in PRP have higher levels of expressed self-reported stress. And again, we kind of measure various dimensions of stress, so stress, exhaustion, effort, or strain. All of those looking at the group that were paid by performance or not paid by performance showed that there were higher levels of stress, exhaustion, effort, and strain, all self-reported, but all higher for performance-related pay than the other treatment. But of course, that's maybe less. While it's consistent with Doman and Falk and Gadsby and maybe the other survey data, the real part of this paper is thinking about the cortisol. So the first thing I'm going to show you is a complete opposite, or it's a completely different kind of graph of just looking at the average cortisol levels across our 4 samples, where before we had a kind of inverted U relationship. What we ended up getting was what we got in the pilot study, where it looks like the initial cortisol is really high. There's stress coming into the lab, even with more than 10 minutes of relaxation, doesn't seem to relax them enough. So we get kind of these downward sloping cortisol measures, which our health psychology colleagues don't quite understand why we can't seem to relax the people enough. But I guess the kind of key, so what we're really focusing on is the rate of change between performance-related pay and not performance-related pay. And as we can see, the dotted line, these are the PRP respondents. Their rate of decline is slower than the rate of decline in cortisol for those who were in the non-PRP condition. So here we're talking about rates of change more than, again, the overall. We can do lots of comparisons of means. And again, if we've done the experiment correctly, this should be sufficient, although I'll show you some regression results in just a second. We've got our 4 measures, our 3 change measures, and sorry, these aren't in the order that I presented them earlier, but the AUCG is the area under the curve with respect to ground. So that's the overall measure of cortisol. And then the 3 change variables, AUCI, peak change, and overall change, are the 4 measures of cortisol that we have. So just taking the second line here, the overall cortisol level, there's no difference between performance-related pay and not. So the overall level is no different. But for our 3 measures of change, we end up seeing a significant difference between performance-related pay and the non-performance-related pay group, with those who are paid by performance having higher levels of cortisol change than the non-performance related pay folks. Now, as was kind of alluded to earlier, this idea of when they take the, when they're allocated, does it matter if they're in the first session or in the second session? So one way to deal with that is to do an ANOVA that actually controls for the three different things. So one is the treatment effect, so what we're trying to measure here with our simple t-tests. The order effect, so it tells us whether the order matters. And then the carryover effect to see whether in these ANOVA tests, whether there's that overall overarching effect of being in the treatment in the first session impacts that second session. And again, what we find is that the treatment effect is the key thing for our three change variables, the AUCI, the peak change, and the overall change. Those are all statistically significant, p-values of less than 0.05. And the order effect does not matter for the three change variables, though it does matter for the AUCG. As I said, for those people who were in performance-related pay, when they came back, their baseline was much higher, presumably because they were based off the experience that they had the first time. So that affected the overall level of cortisol, but it did not affect the change in any particular way. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool empirical labor economist. I cannot present a paper that doesn't have some regressions, and indeed, we may care about some of these covariates that may be important. So gender is an important determinant of cortisol. We may be worried about underlying ability. So we want to be able to control for at least the things that we can control for in the demographic information, but also because we have this crossover where we see people twice, we can do a fixed effects regression and try to net out the ability. So the table 8 that's in the paper does exactly this. So we can control for a bunch of stuff, and these are the just selected results from that. So ordinary least squares using standard errors that are pooled on the person. So it's really just a pooled OLS. We find, again, for our three change variables that being in PRP increases the cortisol. 9.5 for the AUCI, 0.34 for peak change, 0.45 for overall change. But for our overall measure of cortisol, the AUCG, there's no statistical difference between performance-related pay and not. It's positive, but it's not statistically significant. For our fixed effects, for our fixed effects, where we're trying to control for ability, doesn't change the underlying story, and so ability doesn't seem to be affecting things. Oh, thanks, Fanny. So again, we get our three change variables finding statistically significant effects of increasing cortisol, but for our overall AUC, there's no significant effect. So that's really the basic story. We have similar results if we just take the first session. We don't get necessarily everything statistically significant. We have a much smaller sample though, but all the directionality is the same. To give you a sense of how big these numbers are, it's about a 7 to 10%, depending on which one of these three measures that we look at. It's about a 7 to 10% change with respect to the average cortisol in the sample. And not that we're saying that this is the same, but just to give you a sense of previous literature, Badrick et al. Found that smoking caused a 13% increase in cortisol. So it's not quite as bad as that on a little one-shot, little game, but they're not small, very small effects. Lots of robustness that we've done. The order is important, but the results are consistent, as I said, if we just look at the first session. One thing that you may have noticed is that we did not control for performance in there. As expected, performance-related pay did elicit higher numbers of correct answers, about 19 compared to 16. You'll note that that's not 10. People did continue to work, but hopefully their stress wasn't very high if they had hit their minimum performance contract. More effort may lead to more stress, but at least what Cadsby et al. Showed was that this actually could be endogenous. Cadsby et al. Showed that those people, that performance-related pay could actually reduce effort to some extent, or blunt effort, particularly amongst the risk averse. So it could lead to lower performance than anticipated. So we didn't include it in the paper, but we did do a robustness check. You can throw it in there. It doesn't affect our overall results, but because that was clearly endogenous, we didn't want to try to deal with that. Okay. Last slide, and then happy to take any questions. I appreciate that I've gone over I'm almost right on time. So results that we are giving here, again, it's about trying to establish the science. It's about trying to establish the causal link between performance-related pay and stress. And we think by this experimental design, by using the crossover and by objectively measuring stress, that we have established, at least in an experimental setting, that there does seem to be this strong link between performance-related pay and stress, that if that can be expanded out into the real world, we know that stress is an important part of absences in many developed countries. So in the UK in 2017-18, there were 12.8 million lost workdays due to stress in that year. You know, if performance-related pay is contributing to that, then that has important public health implications. It also may imply, you know, I mentioned earlier that performance-related pay seems to generate a higher level of pay. Some of that may be productivity. Some of it also may be a compensating wage differential for the stress that individuals are getting. It'd be really interesting to kind of look at that in more detail. Depending on who of our team that you would ask, you know, some might say that, you know, we should just get rid of performance-related pay. But even if you didn't want to do that as a human resource manager, somebody trying to deal with setting pay policy, it's important though to realize that this link is likely here. And so what you might want to do is to develop other kinds of policies to mitigate the stress in those performance-related pay jobs. And then just quickly for the rest of the project, so this is just the first paper of the project. We are going to be looking, or we have looked actually, at self-selection. Unfortunately, that experiment got cut right in half by by COVID. Turns out that collecting saliva in the middle of a pandemic is not a good idea. So we didn't get actually many results out of that. Maybe that's unsurprising. We're right now looking at higher stakes, so increasing the piece rate and seeing if that matters. Adding penalties, so adding a kind of quality dimension to this, so you actually have money taken away if you get wrong answers. Monitoring and self-evaluative threat. So this is the idea of kind of the sales board that's up on the wall that shows you in relation to the other salespeople, and whether that adds a different dimension of stress. So we can do that within a lab setting, and we'll also, because this is, again, just a kind of one-shot game, the anticipation of performance-related pay. So when you're waiting up at night before you know that you're going to be paid performance-related pay, does that make any additional effect? So, and there's another issue potentially around intrinsic motivation. We won't look at this in this particular study, but when we've sent this paper out to referees, one of the biggest complaints about the paper was that we don't really have a way of measuring intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, and that may be important too. So that may be useful for their work. Okay, appreciate that I'm over time. I'm happy to stay for as long as anybody has questions, but thank you all very much for your time and your attention. We do have a website here. If you want more information about the project and some of the things that we've been writing, more than happy for you to log on there or to get in contact with me. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith. Any questions?
A quick one. Keith, the measure of performance you used was the number of questions, but from many perspectives, the quality might be the issue, sort of the share that were correct. And, you know, you run the risk that the performance pay generates lots of effort, but not much quality. And so it'd be interesting just to go back and use percent correct instead of just number.
Yeah,
it sounds like
that's
sounds like you're headed there in later work when you have the penalties, but even now.
yeah. I mean, there's a clear pattern by some people that maybe thought about it is a bit of gaming that's going on because you know, division questions take more time, right? If you're writing them out by hand, it's because it's two digit into a 4-digit, so it's not a trivial. Well, it's randomized, but most of the questions that they have were that way, and you could clearly see people clicking. And one of the things that we can do potentially within Z-Tree, which is the experimental program, is we can look at the amount of time that they spend. So it's really clear if they're just clicking through, they're not spending any time. But you know, maybe not, and that's why I'm a little bit hesitant to use this particular experiment, because we're not ever 100% sure whether they're gaming or not. We could easily do that though and see, but I think we'll address it much more head on when we do the penalty study of saying, well, we're going to take away some money from you if you get an incorrect question. So hopefully that will address it. But it's a good point.
Just to follow up, I mean, some of it is an incorrect question, and some of it, as you suggested, is looking for easy questions, you know, specializing. I mean, both are well known in the literature.
Yeah, good. Thanks, John.
Keith, Cynthia has a couple of, I think, one question or the.
Those were just kind of follow-ups, like if we could see the questions and how hard the questions were. And
so the questions are randomly generated. So everybody has different. They have different numbers, but it's the same setup. So everybody in round one, I can't remember off the top of my head, but just say it's addition, and in round two had multiplication, and round three had another addition, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a random number generator such that everybody had different numbers, and sometimes they could be very easy, right? I mean, the addition could be 100 plus 100, right? And obviously that's much easier than 423 plus 3,762 or whatever. But I guess we could have done it that way to have everybody have the same questions, but we wanted it to be as realistic as possible. And again, it was easy for this car salesman to sell us a car because we were desperate and we really wanted to get a new car. Whereas somebody else that's really just kind of window shopping, there would be a lot more effort. And so we wanted to randomize that a little bit.
Any other questions? I mean, one of the things I was just thinking about is that the stress level might change because, you know, when you start a job, because you're doing it kind of the first time or whatever, there might be more stress at the start of the job, but over time, even the same performance level, obviously you learn on the job, and therefore that had a, you know, reduces. Yeah,
I mean, that's kind of the self-selection effect in some sense, because and you know, I mean, obviously it would be great if we could bring them back again and again and again, but obviously that's a challenge in experimental work, and you know, it's expensive to do all of this anyway, which is why we had to get the ESRC, because these are not cheap to analyze. But you're exactly right. I think you'll get two effects with what you're suggesting. The first one is just more comfort. Maybe there's even three effects. There's more comfort in being in that kind of job. Two, you might learn how to do it better, right? So, you know, when you show up and you're a car salesman, you know, the first week, you may not really know how to do it particularly well, but you learn how to do it. There also may be a selection effect that shows, you know, I showed up to this job in the first week and I hated it, or I'm lousy at it, and I get selected out either voluntarily or involuntarily by my boss. And so there may be some of that as well. You know, I would love to be able to perhaps partner with a company, or, you know, do a kind of knowledge exchange thing to really get at that a little bit more, to delve into that. And then the kind of self-selection study, although the results are not been severely compromised by the pandemic and the shutdowns. Was a way to try to get at that, but we haven't been able to do that. But it's certainly on the agenda of things that we want to look at.
I mean, it might be interesting to look at the subjective part of it. I mean, not part of your project, obviously, but in general, there might be way, because you have, let's say in BHPS, you have panel data over time, one can find out how subjective.
Right. So that has already been done
Right.
in some sense, because you can. I mean, Giannis and I looked at stress when we did our paper. But you run into you run into referees, of course, that say, well, we don't believe this because it's all self-selection, and you're trying to find the effect. Whereas interestingly, when we've sent this paper out, they wanted self-selection. They didn't want the exogeneity. So I guess you can't win sometimes. But yeah, I mean, we've already found that, and at least correlationally, yes, performance-related pay generates more stress, even by those who are selecting into those kinds of jobs or select to stay in those kinds of jobs. So perhaps what we're doing is we're finding an underestimate of the actual stress, because obviously if we randomly allocated those people who had selected out and put those folks in there, they may well be even more stressed than the people who ended up staying.
Okay, I think it might be the best time now to stop. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk, and I'm sure there is a virtual clap going around the world.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Keith. And
wonderful. And there is a working paper version of the paper that I've just presented.